Hello, my name is Daryl Van Tongeren. I'm an associate professor of psychology at Hope College, and today I'm going to talk to you about developing a research program in the psychology of religion. So to give you an overview of today's talk, first we're going to talk about how it's important to understand your area. Second, we're going to talk about how it's important to ask a good research question. We're going to discuss the importance of having a vision. We're going to discuss how starting a research program also usually involves starting small and then building from there. We're going to be discussing how to calibrate your methods. And then finally, we're going to talk about some best practices. So really what I want to try to do is provide you with 6 guiding principles for helping launch a research program in the psychology of religion. So first most important thing for you to do is to know your area. Well, what's the best way to start? Read, and then read some more, and then read some more after that. It's really important to become familiar with what research has already been done in your area. It's also, though, important to read outside of your discipline. Read from other disciplines, read from sociology, from theology, from philosophy. It's also important to read other people's perspectives on your area, maybe outside of the academy. What type of fiction or other nonfiction has been written about this? But if you want to gain credibility, you really have to understand the existing literature. You have to know what's been done. You have to know the prominent theories, and you have to understand the dominant ways that people are thinking about your area, conceptually, theoretically, and the methodological approaches that are there. It's important that you immerse yourself in what research has already been conducted. You don't want to do work that's already been conducted, and you do want to know what's been done so you can understand what the next steps are, and to understand where there might be a gap in the research that you might be able to contribute to. So I would suggest one place to start within your own discipline, within the discipline of psychology, would be to start with the very best journals. Now, again, do read interdisciplinarily. Read outside of the academy as well, but within psychology, start with the very best journals. So start with Psychological Bulletin. This is going to be a journal for theoretical and conceptual pieces. So is there anything in Psychological Bulletin or Psychological Review that have kind of provided a state of the field for the area that you're interested in studying? Have there been any conceptual pieces that offer a theoretical framework for how to approach your topic? More closely within personality and social psychology. So I'm a social psychologist. One of our better journals is Personality and Social Psychology Review. What's the state of the field from a social psychological perspective? Psychological Science is one of our top empirical journals. What work has been done there? Probably our very best empirical journal from purely a personality and social psychology perspective is Journal of Personality and Social Psychology, JPSP. Within the field of psychology of religion and spirituality, the APA journal, Psychology of Religion and Spirituality, is a flagship journal. And the International Journal for the Psychology of Religion, the Archive for the Psychology of Religion, is the International Association for the Psychology of Religion's main publication vehicle. So that's another good outlet for research in the area of the psychology of religion and spirituality. So all of these are very good journals. These would be good places to start to see what research has been done in your area, because it's going to be important that you really know your area thoroughly. When you're reading, what you want to try to do is you want to try to identify gaps in the research. So by this, what I mean is, what haven't other people been studying that's really important to investigate? As you're reading through these journal articles, you might find yourself saying, well, what about this? And what's the thing that people are just missing? What's the thing that hasn't been studied? What's the thing that nobody's considering? So for me, I'll use my research on formerly religious individuals. So people who had left religion. That's a big area I'm currently studying. Truthfully, I'm studying kind of religious identity more broadly. But where I wanted to start was with people who had left religion. And what I saw was that scholars were treating all non-religious people virtually about the same. And by this, I mean, they would ask people, are you religious? Yes or no. And if someone said that they were not religious, they were treating this, they were viewing and assuming that someone who said they weren't religious, all those people were the same. But I wondered, what about people who were at one time religious? Isn't it possible that having been religious at one point in your life and then leaving religion, you'd be different? You'd have a different set of schemas. You would have a different psychology. You would behave differently than people who were never religious at all. So research on atheism and disbelief was increasing, which is good. There was more research being done on non-religious individuals, but very little work was focusing on religious identity. And I saw this as a problem. I saw this as a gap. I saw this as something that I could contribute to in the research. To put a point on it, people who identified as once being religious, but were no longer identifying as religious, they were being viewed by researchers as similar to those who were never religious. But I don't think that that necessarily is true. If you were raised religious in a religious household with religious values and at one point were religious, once you stop identifying, you might still carry some of the same psychological features that you did when you were religious. The way that you process information and respond behaviorally might be very different than someone who has never been religious. So the big gap I found was that nobody was considering religious history. Nobody had asked about the past. They were just focused on the present. Once you have a good understanding of the research field, once you understand what the current situation in terms of theory and conceptual frameworks might be, you need to ask a good question. So what's the pressing question that needs to be addressed? What's something that's really critical that nobody's asking? And I think that your question should have three characteristics. Okay, first, your question should be important to advance science. So I think about this in terms of significance. You need to ask a significant question, something that's going to move the field forward. It's going to advance science. I think that questions should also be practical. They should matter to everyday people. So it should matter to scientists, it should matter to everyday people, and I think your question should be feasible. So I think that your question should be able to be studied empirically. So a research question like, does God exist? Well, we can't study that empirically. Now, we can study perceptions of God's existence and whether or not people perceive God to exist, whether that affects people's behavior, emotions, or cognitions. But you have to be able to study it empirically. So it should be important to advance science. It should be significant. It should be practical to everyday people. So it should matter. And your question should be feasible. It should be able to be studied in an empirical fashion. So for me, I was curious about non-religious individuals. Again, thinking about religious history and how a lot of researchers were treating non-religious people as virtually the same. So my question centered around whether formerly religious people differed from people who were never religious. So put simply, I was curious, was there a psychological residue of once being religious? So would people carry with them the residual effects of being religious at one point in their life once they no longer identified as a religious person anymore? So I thought my question was important. Nobody had differentiated between types of non-religious people before. And as research was accumulating on on disbelief and atheists and people who were not religious. They treated all these religious nuns, so people who would say that they're not religious, all the same. And so I thought it was important to distinguish that because research was beginning to accelerate in this area, but no one had provided the important nuance to clarify that there might be some differences. I thought my question was practical. Plenty of people have stopped identifying as religious. Right now, the third largest affiliative group in the world are people who report no religious affiliation, who say they're non-religious. But we don't really know much about them. We don't know much about this third group, especially if we treat them all the same. And I knew I could study my question empirically. I could simply ask people to report on their religious history. I didn't think it was that hard. People are usually pretty honest. Not always, but most of the time, people are pretty honest, especially about things like their religious history. So for an example, it was relatively easy for me to assess religious identity in a way that considered religious history. So recall, I was very interested in religious identity, specifically non-religious identity. And in that, I was curious about religious history. So my collaborators and I designed a simple question. Which of the following describes you? I currently identify as religious. I was formerly religious, but no longer identify as religious. Those are people who had left religion. Or I've never identified as religious. So those last two groups, the formerly religious and the never religious, they would look the same to other folks, to other researchers, because they currently do not identify as being religious. But the important difference is that the formerly religious people at one time were actually religious. And I thought that that would make a difference. The third important feature about developing a strong, thriving research program in the psychology of religion is to have a vision. If you're convinced that your question is important, it's practical, and it's able to be studied, you really need to have a vision. And here's what I mean by that. How do you want your research to change the field? Now, I don't necessarily think that every research study you do has to be the most groundbreaking, field-changing research ever. I don't think that every research paper you write necessarily has to win a lot of awards or be featured in prominent newspapers. But I do think you need to think about, over your career, what type of contribution do you want to make? Do you want to help people understand more about the psychology of prayer? Do you want to understand contemplative practices? Do you want to understand how religious services affect people's physiology? Think about what's the contribution you want to make to the psychology of religion. And part of that could be thinking about what type of data do you want to collect that other people have not collected. So not a lot of people had asked about religious history. I wanted to collect that. I have colleagues who are collecting physiological data related to people's worship postures. So how people engage with the sacred might affect what happens to them in their bodies. No one had collected that. And so one of my colleagues, she decided that's the contribution she wanted to make. She wanted to collect that type of data. Like I mentioned, not every study has to change the field, but it should move the field forward in important ways. It can be an incremental change. It can be a nudge, but as long as you have a vision, you know you're working in a coherent and programmatic way to actually making a change in the field. It's important to keep that vision so each study you do can incrementally move you closer toward that goal. So for me, I wanted a better understanding of religious identities. And I wanted to include ones that had not been fully explored before. So I started with what we call religious dones, people who are done identifying as religious. They're formerly religious individuals. And that's where I'm starting. That's where I am now. And we've done a number of different studies looking at formerly religious individuals. But for me, this is just one step in what I hope will be a larger research program that's looking at religious identities more broadly. So for the next project, I hope to explore the full range of people transitioning in their religious identities. So not only people who are leaving religion, but maybe people who have left religion and now they're coming back. Because if you ask them, are they religious? They would say, yes, I am religious. But are they different than people who have always been religious the whole time? Or what about people who weren't religious and then they became religious, but then they're not religious anymore? I think there's a whole range of religious identities that we haven't explored. And so my work on formerly religious individuals is part of a broader research program, a bigger vision on religious identity. And I'm hoping to get there incrementally, one small step at a time. And so the first step for that included my colleagues and I publishing a paper on religious residue. So we ran 3 different cross-cultural studies that found that people who are formerly religious, these religious duns, have religious psychology and behavior that is similar to people who are currently religious, more so than people who have never identified as religious. So there's a psychological residue, a religious residue, that sticks with them even after they de-identify. So something about having been raised religious or identifying as religious at some point in their life. And we believe this could be because of their schemas, which are pretty resistant to change, or habits that are pretty difficult to alter, could be continuing to affect their cognitive, emotional, and behavioral patterns in a way that leaves a bit of a residue. And so we got this paper published in Journal of Personality and Social Psychology, which is, again, the flagship journal in social psychology, to try to help nudge the field in that direction, to make an incremental contribution to work on formerly religious individuals. You might be thinking, oh my goodness, changing the field, having a big vision, this all seems so overwhelming. So let me put you at ease. I think it's important to start small and then build. Okay, so here's one approach to doing this, and kind of how I started small and then build up from there. I think that a completed study is better than a study that never happens. And what I mean by that is you don't have to wait to plan the best, biggest, most perfect study. Sometimes it's important just to get some data, just to get something that you can look at empirically. And think about what's actually feasible for you. What can you do in terms of expertise, in terms of resources, including time and money, in terms of available participants? Think about what you can actually do, starting small and then building up from there. So what are your resources? Do you have any grant funding that could help pay for participants? If you don't, that's okay. You don't always have to have grant funding. There's lots of things that you can do that won't require grant funding. Do you have access to survey creation opportunities online, like SurveyMonkey or Qualtrics? Do you have access to reliable paper and pencil surveys? Do you have access to a participant pool at a university or a college? So you want to think about time as a resource, money as a resource, and your own expertise. What do you feel comfortable doing? What are the methodologies and the statistics that you feel comfortable doing? How comfortable do you feel running a large-scale project versus a smaller project? Again, start small, then build. Do you have a research staff that can help you, or do you have to do this all by yourself? And what's the capability and training of your research staff? How available are participants? Are you at a university that has kind of inherent in it research components in classes where students could be participants, and perhaps they could be participants for free. Do you live by a metropolitan area where there's a shopping center, where there are stores or coffee shops where you can ask people to volunteer? Could you go to the bus stop or the train station to ask people to take part in your study? So how could you start small, especially with what you have access to right now? Well, here's what it could look like. First, think about that question for you. Can you start small? Write down the answers to what do you have in terms of time and money, expertise, research staff, participant availability. Write that down. Then, what would it look like to take that next step? What would be the next thing you would want to do? So what could you do now, and what could be that next step? And then write down, what would a dream study look like? If you could design your perfect study, the one that answers the questions you really want to answer, what would that look like? And are there ways that you can move toward that? Start by building small steps toward that goal. Start with what you can do, and then move toward what your dream study might look like. Let me give you an example. So here's the steps that I used. I began by conducting research on my research participant pool, which was comprised of undergraduate students. So these were students that were enrolled in an Introduction to Psychology course who participated in faculty research as a part of a course requirement. It was free, it was available, and I could do some very modest studies with these students. I could bring them into the lab for an hour and they would get credit, and I could collect some data. Now, I teach at a small private religious institution. So my next step was to collaborate with researchers to get larger samples that were also more diverse. So most of my participants are religious, and I don't have an incredibly big participant pool. I only have 200, 300 students in my participant pool. I collaborated with researchers at larger universities that had 1,200, 1,500 participants in their pool each semester, and were much more diverse. Not all were religious, which is important for someone who's studying non-religious identities like me. Then I started collaborating with colleagues in other countries. I reached out. I started making connections at conferences, or sometimes just directly emailing them, asking them if they'd be interested in collaborating. One person I met at a conference, and he was working at a university in the Netherlands. We shared a common interest, and we decided to do a study together. After that, I started collecting data from community members. So in addition to recruiting participants from undergraduate psychology classes, and then with my collaborators, getting larger, more diverse samples, and collaborators in other countries, I brought people in from the community. I got a small grant, and I was able to pay people to come into the lab and take a study. After this, I used that data to get a larger grant where I could start collecting data through online panels. So Amazon's Mechanical Turk or Cloud Research or Qualtrics provides opportunities to collect data from online panels. And these panels can be local in your own country, or they can be from other countries. So I finally shifted to collecting larger panel studies from several different countries. And that's the project that just is in press right now, got published, accepted to be published at the Journal of Personality and Social Psychology. But I had to start with my undergraduate research students and slowly build up from there. So with small steps, you can move toward the dream study you really want to complete. The fifth thing to think about is that it's important to calibrate your methods. So what are you most interested in? What's the thing? Are you interested in cause and effect? Are you interested in change over time? Are you interested in what happens in somebody's body? Are you interested in that physiological or neuroimaging? Are you interested in cross-cultural differences? Think about what's the thing you're most interested in. So for direct and easy questions, so things like religious history, a self-report survey might be fine. So you're going to ask people questions. They're going to write down their answers or respond to pre-existing options that you give them in a big survey. And the advantage here is you can get a lot of people to complete these self-report surveys because they can be done in a packet or online. And for direct, easy questions, it's a pretty low cost, resource light way of collecting data. Now, let's say you're interested in cause and effect. You want to know, does this variable cause this other variable? Does prayer cause better health? You're going to be thinking about experimental research. You're going to be randomly assigning people to one of two conditions. And then you're going to be comparing them on the outcome variable when the only thing that's different between those two groups is that experimental condition. So you're going to be maybe assigning one group to intercessory prayer, maybe a second group to prayers of gratitude, and then a third group to be a control group just to, think positive thoughts. Then after that, you're going to measure your critical variable, that core outcome variable you're most interested in. Maybe you're interested in how things change over time. Maybe you want to know whether or not religion helps reduce stress. And so you want to see as stress unfolds over one's life, is that going to make a difference? So you're interested in change over time. So you would want longitudinal methods. So here, you'd want to collect data at multiple time points. And then you'd want to be able to compare people on those multiple time points. Maybe you're curious about mechanisms of change. What's the thing that's actually causing those changes? So these longitudinal methods, maybe you collect data from participants at time 1, and then 6 months later is time 2, and 6 months after that is time 3. Mechanisms of change would be combining the cause and effect of experimental research with the time assessment of longitudinal methods. So maybe what you would do is you would assign one group to prayer and one control group to positive thinking. So you have that experimental condition, but then you're assessing them at multiple time points. So now, and then again in 1 month, and then again in 1 month after that. But again, those two groups are differing simply based on the experimental condition they're in, prayer or the control group of positive thinking. Maybe you're interested in how phenomenon affects daily life. So you could do either a daily diary method or an experience sampling method. So the daily diary method is where people agree to be in a study for, let's say, anywhere between 7 and 28 days. So 1 week to 4 weeks. And at the end of each day, you ask them questions to reflect on their day. So maybe you ask them, how much did you pray today? Or did you even pray today? And then they fill out a very short survey. And they do this every single day for 1 week or all the way up to 4 weeks. And what you can find is on days that they prayed, did they have better mental health or physical health outcomes? Or maybe you do an experience sampling method. And what this is you can have people sign up for a study, and these are shorter studies, maybe anywhere between 3 and 7 days. But what you do is you sample them multiple times throughout the day. So you would send them a message either on their phone or via email, and then once in the morning, once in the afternoon, once in the evening, at random times, to see whatever they're doing at these random times of the day, to see if their religiosity, if their prayer life, if their connection with the sacred or the divine, that affects whatever they're doing in their daily life. Maybe you're interested in how the body is involved or how the body is affected. Like my colleague who's studying worship posture. Then you would want to study or use physiological approaches. So maybe you would want to look at their cortisol, their stress response, or their skin conductance, again, to see if they're stressed out. Maybe you'd want to look at their heart rate variability or their blood pressure. All of these things could be good indicators of what's going on in their body. Maybe you want to figure out the role of different brain regions or brain structures with different religious phenomena. Well, then you'd have to use neuroscientific methods, maybe looking into fMRI or PET scans. Maybe you'd want to measure a brand new construct. Maybe there's something that no one's ever studied before, and there's no way to measure it. There's no way to assess that thing. There was a time we really didn't know how to measure gratitude. So people developed a gratitude scale. And more recently, that's been applied to God, people demonstrating gratitude towards God. So you'd want to really think about scale development and validation. So going through the process of developing a new scale, showing that it's a reliable and valid measure, and it's better than other existing measures. So what you want to do is you want to develop expertise in one area. So for me, I'm trained as an experimental social psychologist. So I do a lot of experiments, cause and effect, not all the time, but that's really where my expertise is in. After my undergraduate work, I got a master's degree in experimental psychology. Then I went from there, and that was a 2-year program. I spent 5 years getting a Ph.D. in experimental social psychology, and then spent a year as a postdoctoral fellow doing work in that area before my faculty position. So my expertise is in experimental social psychology approaches. So I bring this expertise to all my collaborations. They know that if they need to design an experiment or they need someone who's well-versed in social psychology, I'm that person. Then I've worked with people who are experts in scale development and longitudinal designs. And so what happens is as a team, we're much stronger through collaborations. And I've learned more about those methods and how to incorporate them in my own work. So I wasn't originally trained in longitudinal designs very much, but through working with other people who are experts, I've begun to incorporate those more. And I had some training in scale development in graduate school, but have gotten much more as I've worked on projects with other people who are experts in scale development. So what are some best practices that you should think about as you're engaging with developing a thriving research program in the psychology, religion, and spirituality? One best practice that's going on is the practice of open science. And by open science, what we mean is a transparency and a visibility of the type of work that you're doing in order to try to increase the reproducibility and how able your work is to be replicated by other researchers. So there is the Open Science Framework, or the OSF. And the Open Science Framework is a place where you can kind of organize all of your research materials. You can make predictions ahead of time before you run your studies. You can upload your materials, you can upload your data, and you can even put any type of additional things that you wouldn't necessarily publish with your paper. Supplemental materials can be housed on the Open Science Framework. A common thing that's happening now is what's called pre-registration. So researchers are making decisions about the work that they'd like to do, the studies that they like to run, and they're pre-registering it. They're saying what their hypotheses are before they run the study, what measures they're going to include, and what type of statistical analyses they're going to run before they do anything. All of that is done through the Open Science Framework, the OSF. Once you collect the data, you can make your data open. This means other researchers can look at your data. And I know that sometimes researchers get very concerned about this. They feel very protective over their data. They think their data are like their children. They want to protect them. But sharing your data can also lead to more discoveries in your area. You can post the materials you use so other researchers can see the exact questions you used, and maybe they'll ask those same questions in their research. You can post your preprints. This means your papers before they're actually accepted, before they're published, on SciArchive. And so this is just a website that hosts preprints, papers, before they're actually accepted. And this gets the word out before the peer review process is done and increases the visibility of your work. You can also consider publishing at open access journals. So these are ones that are not regulated by a paywall where institutions have to pay. Now, sometimes, though, open access journals cost money to publish. And so that can be a little bit prohibitive. It's prohibitive for me. I can't really always afford open access journals, but sometimes universities have agreements or can make funds available for open access. It's also a good practice to collaborate. Science happens in teams. It doesn't happen by just one person anymore. The best science happens in teams. So be a good collaborator. Prioritize when other people reach out to you and they want you to collaborate. Make sure you get back to them quickly, get back to them effectively and with your very best work. And start developing a niche of what you can contribute. Think about what expertise do you bring to the team and bring that to all of your collaborations. Again, for me, it was being an experimental social psychologist. This next one's very important. You need to schedule and protect your research time. A lot of academics feel very anxious that they don't have enough time to do research or to write or to analyze data. What happens is it spills into the weekends or into the evenings or into holidays when they should be relaxing or spending time with their families. And they're feeling very burned out. So what you need to do is commit to research and writing. So for me, that's every workday. And I'll explain this here in just a minute. And schedule your writing and protect it like any other professional commitment. So you'd never schedule a doctor's appointment during a time when you're teaching. So why would you do that during a time when you are supposed to be writing? And if you schedule and protect it, you won't be tempted to give away that time. And if you put it during the week, you'll actually find yourself having much more time for other things and not worrying when you're not writing because you know the next time you're going to write. It's best practice to apply for external funding. Start with small pilot data. Collect the data that you can reasonably and feasibly, and then make sure that you look for places with good fit. So the John Templeton Foundation funds a lot of research on religion, but they're not the only ones. Look for funding sources that might fund the type of research that you're interested in. Apply to small awards first to build experience and credibility. So you don't want the first grant you write to be millions and millions of dollars. You want to start small and show that you're responsible with their money, that you can effectively accomplish the project, and that you can produce a return on what they give you in the grant, that you can produce the research papers, you can produce the conferences, the edited books, whatever it is you promise, you can deliver those outputs. Then gradually apply for larger proposals if they fit your work. Again, it's all about fit. And as long as they fit your work, apply to those larger proposals. So let me give you an example. What I do is in the summer, each year, I meet with 2 other collaborators and we make annual research goals. At the beginning of the semester, so then I do this twice a year, in the fall and in the spring, I first schedule when I'm teaching my classes. That's the first thing that goes into my empty schedule. The second thing that goes into my empty schedule is my research and writing time. That's the very second thing. Once I know when I'm teaching, and then I know when I'm doing research and writing, everything else comes after that. Because I know those 2 are my priorities, and everything else can fill in my workday. So think about when you do your best thinking. So for me, that's in the morning. And you want to protect that for research and writing time. it's important to start small but be consistent. So in graduate school, I tried to write 1 hour per day, Monday through Thursday. So that was 4 hours per week. But I made it a habit. Later in graduate school, I increased that to 2 hours per day, Monday through Thursday. So I was up to 8 hours a week. Now, in my faculty position, I write each weekday morning, Monday through Friday, from 7 to 10 a.m. So I'm writing 15 hours per week. I don't schedule anything else between 7 and 10. I protect that time. I don't teach. I don't do other things. That's my dedicated research and writing time. Okay, we've covered a lot. And when we communicate in person again, and when we have a little bit more time to interact, I'm happy to answer any of these questions. I think the psychology of religion is an exciting and growing field of study. I think mainstream psychology can inform, but is also informed by the psychology of religion. They're interdependent on one another. And you can develop a thriving research program in this area if you work through those 6 steps. I really think that it's feasible. These are the steps that worked for me, and I really think that they can work for you as well. Here's my contact information. Feel free to email me at vantongeren@hope.edu. You can also check out my website, darylvantongeren.com, to see the type of work that I do. And I'm really looking forward to communicating with you all virtually. I'm looking forward to our workshop. Very excited about the chance that we will have to interact, and I look forward to your questions.
Perfect. So thank you very much for your time. It's a very good opportunity to talk about our research and differences between our contexts. In your presentation, you mentioned several topics very interesting to this discussion. You mentioned about having a great funding to help paying people to collaborate as participants in studies, for example.
Right.
You also mentioned that maybe the researchers teach at a university that has kind of inherent in the research components in classes where students could be participants, and perhaps they give him or her participants for free. In this sense, undergraduate students enrolled in an introduction to psychology course, for example, could participate in faculty research as a part of course requirement. I would like to point out some cultural differences about considering the Brazilian context. In Brazil, more specifically in social psychology research area, to pay the participants is not considered appropriate. In the field of medicine, this has been discussed in terms of pros and cons. But in social psychology, it's considered that participants' payment can cause social desirability biases. Participants could respond to questionnaires or complete experiment tasks according to what they think is the researcher's expectance. Usually, it's acceptable paying for occasional expenses, such as transportation and food, if applicable, but not cash compensation for completing the experimental tasks, for example. Participants are only volunteers. The same is true of university students. They can voluntarily participate in a research, but they cannot participate in a research for any kind of compensation or as a prerequisite of a course. Some private universities even prohibit teachers from collecting data with their students. So I would like to ask you, how you address this problem of social desirability considering that in the US, it's very common to pay participants or recruit undergraduate students to be participants as prerequisite for some course.
Yes, of course, I'd be happy to share. So, some standard practices in the United States that you refer to is we do find it ethical to offer a small compensation for participants for their time. Now, we have to be careful not to offer an extremely high monetary compensation because that could be considered excessive, and we don't want to coerce participants to participate. But what most ethics boards find reasonable is a small amount of monetary compensation for their time. In order to make sure that we're avoiding social desirability biases, like you bring up, we assure that participants will get paid without us looking at their answers at all. So their surveys are always kept completely separate from their and not linked to their names, so they're able to maintain confidentiality. But also they get paid regardless of what their response is or how they respond in the study. So we affirm that to them, that they can discontinue at any time and that won't negatively affect them. We feel that helps reduce the possibility that participants are just trying to give answers that would get paid, because they're going to be getting paid anyway. We also try to encourage the participants to realize that they're really helping make a contribution to science. And so we couldn't do this without them. And that's why we need them to be honest, and we need them to do their very best, because we're trying to discover something we think is important, and they have the opportunity to help.
Perfect.
Within the university setting, introductory to psychology students, we require that they learn about research, and we give them two options. One option to learn about research is to be a participant in a study, and they would earn course credit. And there's always a wide variety of studies that they could participate in. So they're not forced into any participation of any study they don't want. Or if they don't want to participate, they can read about research and just write up a short report. So we really give them two different options. A lot of students enjoy being participants, and so will go ahead and participate, but some don't want to, and that's completely fine. And they would just read some research and write a report.
Perfect. Thank you. Another question is the importance of replication in social psychology of religion, psychology of religion in the broad concept. In contexts like Brazil, it's very difficult to have experiments in psychology of religion. So it would be a very interesting starting point to conduct some experiments that people like you have done already. So what do you think about the very start point and make replications in this field?
Yeah, this is a really interesting and important question. I'm glad that you asked it. So as you brought up, replication is very important for psychology, especially social psychology and psychology of religion. And it's important that we replicate our findings, not only to make sure that our findings are accurate and valid, but also replicate our findings across cultures to see whether or not the phenomena that we're studying are universal, or whether there are cultural variation or differences between different societies. And so I think for people who are interested in cross-cultural research, one good way to start could be to take a study that's already been done, that's been published, reach out to that author and see if they'd be willing to collaborate in trying to see if the results would replicate in another country, such as Brazil. And what they could do is, if it doesn't replicate, that doesn't necessarily mean that the phenomenon doesn't work. Rather, it could be the case that there are some cultural differences that have give rise to the effect working in one context but not in another one.
Perfect. So thank you for your considerations, Daryl. It's very important to make clear contextual difference that must be considered when they elaborate a research proposal to get a grant or award, for example. So thank you very much.
Yes. Thank you.